Thanks for coming, everyone. So you are refusing to sit at the front and create the impression it's full. Yeah. So today we have a presentation by Claire on the importance of green spaces in greenness in green spaces, right? So Claire is from a place I know, the University of Alberta, and she is a Canadian, right? Not an American studying in Canada, so you can be sure that she will not call anyone an idiot. She might just say a jerk. It's
I plan on being very funny.
Yeah, so relax and enjoy.
Okay, thanks for that. So thank you very much for joining us online and also in person here. My name is Claire. I'm presenting the second component of my PhD research. My supervisors are Michael Burton and David Pannell. And before I get started, I'd just like to gratefully acknowledge the funders of my research and my PhD experience, the Forest Research Foundation, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Government of Western Australia, Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. Hi, Warren. Okay, so this research is about understanding public preferences for urban park designs. And so to start, I'm showing you this rendering of what you might be familiar with as a local or neighborhood park in the Perth region. So these local or neighborhood parks are pretty small in size. They are designed to serve really local communities. So they might be located within about a 5 or a 10-minute walk of where you live or where you work. They're designed for more passive recreation purposes like enjoying nature or just general recreation, not so much sporting activities. You know, this isn't going to have a full sporting oval for organized sport. And then in terms of the contents, it's likely to have maybe a playground and some pathways. But I'm focused on the vegetation in this study. So these parks typically have some tree cover. They are conventionally dominated by watered grass. So maybe about 80% of the ground cover is grass that's watered throughout the summertime, with about 20% mulch that's placed either around the edges or around the trees. And so we want to understand how the public might respond if this conventional park design were to change. And there's a few ways that this could happen. One option would be to replace some of that grassed area with more mulch or native vegetation. We could also choose to keep the proportions as they are, but instead no longer water the grassed area and let it go brown in periods of drought or in the summertime. Another option is to replace the areas of grass with native vegetation, so plants that once they're established, they don't need to be watered. Or maybe the public wants to see a park that has even more grass and even more tree cover. And then, of course, there's a lot of intermediate stages between these 4 park designs. So why do we care about park design, urban park design in local and neighborhood parks? Well, these parks that are dominated by watered grass use a lot of water. In Western Australia, 17% of urban water use goes towards irrigating these spaces, parks and gardens. And in Perth, this water primarily comes from groundwater. So we're aware that with climate change, the groundwater tables are declining, especially with increased periods of drought in the summertime. Right now, local park managers access this groundwater to irrigate their parks through a licensing system from the government, but it's possible that in the future these licenses might go down, and so park managers maybe need a bit of guidance on how they can redesign their parks or shift their management practices in response to this water scarcity. So I've included a picture of the WaterWise Perth Action Plan here. This document outlines a lot of different strategies that managers could take in order to adapt to a drier climate in Perth. And this includes just irrigating more efficiently with different systems and a whole range of water-sensitive urban design principles, maybe treating wastewater or just different types of designs. But for us in the study, we're exclusively focusing on conserving water by rethinking the vegetation that's in the park in the first place. So what do we know about parks and public preferences for parks in general? There's a lot of literature on parks. They're nice to study because they're relatable and they're valuable in a lot of ways for our mental health, for our physical health. But as I was looking through the literature, I found that the main focus was on parks as sort of a homogeneous group. So looking at the value of adding more parks in general, just park area, or recovering lost areas of greenery, or preventing an existing park from being redeveloped for a different purpose. So not as much focus on trade-offs within a specific park, or and especially as it relates to the water that's required to maintain these parks. If we're looking at specific contents of a park, there are some studies that consider a whole range of quality attributes of parks, like the amenities that are in there, the facilities, and how well it's maintained, if it's clean. Like this one here found that plant species richness is very important to people, but not as important as how clean the park is. But I specifically want to focus on different types of ground cover in the park, like the water grass. So we build on one study that has done something similar, Van Buren and Blamey. Now this was also linked to DWER and followed a similar rationale or similar motivation of, okay, we might expect that in Perth, park managers are faced with a scenario where they have to remove irrigation in 20% of the park. So imagine a world where in the future, 20% of the park area is no longer going to be green grass. How would the public respond to this, or how would they tolerate this change, and what trade-offs are they willing to make? So it could be letting it go brown, or converting it to native vegetation, or even accepting some brownness in favor of upgrades of park facilities. So decisions like that. We build on this study by using a different set of assumptions and a different modeling technique. We also consider a broader range of changes, so beyond just possibly 20% of that park area being converted to a different ground cover type. And then we also consider tree cover in our park designs. So we did a choice experiment for the study. For our survey, we started developing this quite a while ago in early 2020, and the early stages of survey development involved doing some site visits with different park managers from different local government areas across the Perth region. And they were really helpful in helping me understand what a typical baseline park is for these local and neighborhood parks, and what some realistic alternative park designs might be in the future. So I was really grateful, especially to the town of Victoria Park, for all of their time that they gave in kind of helping me understand the context. As we continued developing the survey, we realized maybe we're asking the public to do something that they don't really feel comfortable doing. So we're asking them to imagine having a park that has a different type of vegetation in it, and to consider, percentage changes in that park area. So it could be really hard to visualize those changes. And so we connected with a landscape architect to create some specific scenario images to accompany the information that was in the table of the choice experiment. And this was a bit of a tricky process to really communicate how important it is in choice experiments to get the actual proportions accurate and have the pictures line up with the specific percentages. So there's a lot of back and forth there, but in the end, I'm really happy with the images that we wound up with. Because of COVID uncertainties, we tested the study in a series of phone interviews. So we didn't do a conventional focus group setup, but I sent the survey to 12 different people and asked them to complete it and highlight confusing parts beforehand. And then we had a 1-hour one-on-one interview about how the experience was and what they found challenging. And I found that I got really good feedback that way, and it was comfortable, and yeah, it worked pretty well over the phone. So I would do that again, maybe. And then we administered the survey with a market research company in April. We collected 1,600 responses, and I am presenting the results and analyzing about 1,500 responses as the people who were non-protest responders that we identified as people who chose the status quo option in each case and responded in a certain way to some follow-up questions. So this is a very busy slide that outlines my attributes and the different levels in my choice experiment. So really our focus is on the ground cover here. And so we're considering a park area as a whole, or a specific park as a whole, and considering that the park needs to be covered with something. So we have 4 different ground cover types: watered grass, not watered grass, native vegetation, and mulch, and those need to sum to 100%. We're assuming that the amount of cover that's in the path or the stump of the tree is negligible. So those need to sum to 100%. They can vary between 0 and 100% in 3 of those cases. But for the mulch category, we heard from park managers that really you're never going to have a park that's 100% mulch, and so you can cut that off at a 40% maximum. And then for fun, we also add in the tree canopy cover element. So there's 3 different levels: low, medium, and high. And the bolded level is the baseline park. So that's 80% watered grass, 20% mulch, and medium tree canopy cover. And then our price instrument, our tax component, was presented as either a change in your council rate if you're a property owner, or if you're a renter, the change in your rental rate, just to be a little bit more inclusive. The vast majority of my sample were homeowners, but we include that either way. And then initially the plan was to start with no changes in your council rate, and then look at deviations upwards and downwards from that point to maybe look at willingness to pay and willingness to accept changes in park designs, depending on if it was perceived as an increase or a decrease in quality. But we found that in the interviews, nobody believed that your rates would actually ever go down. And so it was more believable to tell them, you know, imagine this is a typical year and your rates are going to go up by $200, and then it can deviate from that point down to $0 or up to $400. Or, oh yes, so here we just have an example choice set where we have all of the information in numbers and then words in the table, and then the accompanying picture. So we have 38 scenario-specific images for a total of 60 of these choice sets. Respondents were presented with 6 binary choices randomly assigned, and the order of the choice sets were randomized within a block too. We put together the experimental design using Engine. So this is an example where your tax rates would actually go down from that baseline of $200 to instead be $50, an increase in your council rate or rent. And then this park design is just entirely changing the ground cover to be native vegetation and decrease the tree cover. This is just a second example of one of these choice sets. In this case, the rental rate was an increase from the baseline level with increased tree cover and more watered grass. So to analyze the data, we start with a base conditional Logit model and look at preferences for the sample as a whole. And then we wanted to dig into some preference heterogeneity, and we chose to do that with a latent class model instead of a random parameter model, because we also are interested in understanding a little bit about the characteristics of the people that are driving differences in preferences. So our utility function is a function of the status quo alternative. We have the 2 tax options, the tax increase or the tax decrease. And then for both the level of trees and the ground cover, we include the level and the squared term, because we kind of expect that there's going to be some decreasing marginal utility with any of these attributes. So, you know, if you have a park that currently has no watered grass at all, and you consider adding 20% grass, that might be super valuable. But if you're going from 90 to 100% grass, you probably value that extra 10% a little bit less. And so we've got our 4 ground cover types that I listed there. To avoid having a situation with perfect collinearity between those, we exclude the baseline mulch from the model. And so we interpret the watered grass, not watered grass, and native vegetation relative to mulch. But then we have all the square terms. Very quickly, here is a boring table with the conditional Logit model results. So here we can see it's always a good check when your tax parameter is negative. So both are negative and statistically significant. The effect size for a tax increase is greater than the effect size for the tax decrease, which suggests that people are more sensitive to price increases than price decreases, which is good. So The sample really likes trees to a certain point. It does level off at some point. Relative to mulch, they really like water grass. They're indifferent between not water grass and mulch, and they like native vegetation more too. And then we have some significant smoothing effects there too with the square terms. So this is nice, but it doesn't really tell us a lot about the whole story of, public preferences for parks. So we go on to the latent class analysis. We did that in latent gold. We varied the number of classes between 2 and 6 and selected 4 based on VIC. And so I'm just going to step through some of the differences between these 4 classes in a table here. So here we have class 1. Class 1, they really like trees. They like water grass, not water grass, and native vegetation more than mulch. But the effect size of these 3 coefficients is actually pretty similar. So I guess we can say they're a little bit indifferent between these 3, but they definitely like it more than mulch. For class 2, again, they like trees. They like water grass more than mulch, but there's no real differences in preferences for mulch, not water grass, and native vegetation. Moving on to class 3, this group didn't really display many strong preferences for anything, for any of the park attributes. The status quo with coefficient estimate is significant. So this is a group that just wanted to choose something new, and they don't really care what's in this park, but they just liked pressing the button maybe. So we do interpret the results of class 3 with a little bit of caution because there aren't really any strong effects there. And then on to class 4. This group, again, they like trees. Everyone likes trees. And they're pretty indifferent between water grass and native vegetation and mulch, but they do prefer mulch over not water grass. So some small differences across the 4 groups. I know that this table isn't very insightful, so we will present the results in a more visual way, but that's just an overview. And you'll notice that the tax decrease coefficient estimates were not significant in any of the cases except for class 4. And so when I go forward, I'm just going to be discussing the willingness to pay elements that are associated with the tax increase. So before I present some pictures that represent those results, I'm just going to dig into the class membership estimates here too. So we chose 4 factors to explain class membership. We had the age of the respondents, if they were female, whether they had kids under the age of 18 living at home with them, and then this future water scarcity variable. So this is a variable that was constructed. It's a factor score out of respondents' responses to 3 questions. So the question was, in the next 5 years, I expect that blank will be negatively impacted by issues related to water scarcity. And then the options were myself or my family, people in Perth, or people in Australia. So that variable captures responses to those Likert scale questions. And so if it's positive, you had a greater concern over future water scarcity. So class 1, just as a reminder, their preferences from the latent class model is up top. This group preferred water grass, not water grass, and native vegetation over mulch. And who are these people? Well, you're more likely to be in class 1 if you are younger, male, and had concern over future water scarcity. Then we move to class 2. So class 2 preferred water grass over mulch and was pretty indifferent across the other ground cover types. This group, you're more likely to be in class 2 if you're a little bit older and have kids and did not have as much concern over future water scarcity. So I guess it's kind of neat that maybe this group that has kids are really concerned that their kids have some water grass to play on, that maybe have no snakes in it, whatever it might be. Class 3, they didn't really have many strong preferences for the ground cover types, and unsurprisingly, they also aren't really defined very well by these explanatory variables. So we just know that they are less concerned about future water scarcity. And then on to class 4. This was the group that was pretty indifferent between water grass, native vegetation, and mulch, but they did prefer mulch over not water grass. So I know there's a lot of puzzle pieces and a lot to keep straight here, but some differences across these 4 groups. And class 4, these were people who were a bit older and had concern over future water scarcity. Okay, no more tables, now just pictures. So the way that we chose to represent the results is maybe a little bit different for choice experiments, but the reason why we came to these pie charts of optimal ground cover combinations is that we have a park and we're constraining that park to be equal to 100% ground cover. And so we can optimize the different levels of ground cover types within a group to see which park design would give them the maximum utility. So it's different across the 4 groups, and there's a couple of things that are maybe interesting across these. One is that across none of the classes, they have all 4 ground cover types in it, so it's either 2 or 3. Another interesting thing is that all 4 classes do want to have some water grass in there. So that ranges from about a third to about a half, or maybe more than a half. So it's important to have some water grass, but the optimal extents do vary. And if we go back to the class membership table, remember class 1 and class 4 had more concern over issues related to future water scarcity. And this was also the group that had a lower optimal extent of water grass in their utility maximizing combination. So that's not really surprising, but it's kind of a neat check.
Are you happy for people to ask questions just here in Zoom?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
So how was this calculated? How do you work out the optimal?
Yes. So the question was, how did we work out this utility maximizing optimal combination? And we did it in Excel. So I just had the coefficient estimates from my latent class model. So those were the we calculated utility as that estimate times the level. So we had both the level coefficient and the squared coefficient. So for example, for class 1, it would be coefficient on water grass plus coefficient on water grass squared times the level of water grass squared. And then we just used solver. So we entered in, we had boxes for the 4 ground cover types, and we said, let those levels of ground cover for this class vary and spit out the level that gives me the maximum possible utility, given a constraint that they have to sum to 100 and mulch has to be less than 4 feet. So, I mean, we double checked in this data just by looking at maximum possible utility, but the mechanics were all in solver. And I wasn't expecting to use so much Excel in my PhD, but I'm using it a lot, and I think it's kind of a fun result. So
interpretation. The combination of covers that would make the person happy.
Yeah. The maximum possible utility across the 4 groups, these are the levels. So that's excluding the tree cover, and this is also just, this doesn't consider the cost of creating these. So these aren't like society-wide optimization yet, but just for this group, assuming they can have whatever they wanted, this is their preferred combination.
For the average person.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So to use all these 4 together, would you weight each class by the proportion of people in the group?
Yes.
Assume representative or something?
Yes. So Steve just asked to use these together. Would you want to weight them to be representative? And I'm still on my conclusion slide, but
Oh, okay.
but that's okay.
Oops.
Let's jump to the conclusion right away. Yes. So what we can do with these 4 classes, like they're very nice on their own, but what we've done is taken the coefficient estimates and normalized them by the cost coefficient, by the beta price increase parameter, to get a normalized estimate of the utility associated with those different classes. And then we weight it by the class membership size right here. So class 1, 36%, 28%. So then we get these revised estimates, and then we just redid the optimization in solver with those revised coefficients. And so when you combine those together, it's kind of funny because you actually get like really round numbers. So the combined optimization was 50% water grass, 25% native vegetation, and 25% non-water grass. So mulch is out of the equation there.
How does that translate into the what they will pay then?
Yeah.
Is that your next slide as well?
No, it's not. So the question was, how does that optimal combination translate into what they would be paying? So I haven't considered costs yet. That's stage 3 of my PhD. So I'm going to be going into, also on the conclusion side, a benefit cost analysis that considers the actual costs of creating these different parks. So of one, creating it if it was a brand new park in a new suburb, or two, to redesign and retrofit existing parks, like pulling up the grass and maybe converting them to these other things. So yeah, I don't really know what the cost yet, but
I was referring to those paybacks.
Okay. Sorry, can you say the question again?
Yeah, well, these different utility maximizing combinations probably correspond also to specific or different willingness to pay.
Yeah.
And so
that is my next slide.
So, oh, it is.
Here. So we can convert these utility maximizing combinations for the 4 groups into some willingness to pay measures.
At least I'm listening.
Yeah. At least you would design your presentation the same way that I designed my presentation. So the way we've calculated willingness to pay is maybe a little bit different from a conventional choice experiment, because we have this utility function that includes both the level term and also the square term. So normally you would take beta water grass and divide it by beta price parameter with a negative sign, and there's your willingness to pay. But here it's more annoying because the derivative of utility with respect to water grass is beta water grass plus 2 times beta water grass squared times the level of water grass over the price parameter. So the level of or the willingness to pay is dependent on the specific level of that ground cover that you have in the park. And so to get around that, we came up with this new approach to, well, not new approach, this alternative way of representing it. We look at bundles of utility. So these willingness to pay estimates that I've listed here, $1,300 for class 1, smaller for class 3, $49. These values represent the willingness to pay for their optimal bundle by group compared to what they have to start. So we calculate the utility associated with, for class 1, 47% native vegetation, water grass and not water grass, and then we subtract the utility associated with that baseline, 80% water grass and 20% mulch. So it's that difference in utility divided by the price parameter that gives us these compensating surplus type measures of willingness to pay. So I haven't done a lot of work about these numbers yet. For now, I've mostly just been interested in this optimal combination, but these will have some sort of a role in the future benefit cost analysis that we design. So it is a bit different because we're comparing 2 different bundles. Okay. I'm gonna leave this here for a second. There's a lot to digest in this graph. So another way that we choose to represent the willingness to pay, that last slide, that just showed a single snapshot for that utility maximizing combination compared to the starting point of 80% water grass and 20% mulch. But then we were curious to see what would happen if you deviated away from that optimal park mix. And so for each of the 4 classes, we've created these graphs, and what we did is, again, in Excel, using Solver, we constrained water grass to be a certain level. So, and then we optimized for the remaining ground covers, given that level of water grass. And we do this 10 times, varying water grass at intervals of 10 between 0 and 100. And then you kind of get this neat visual representation of, assuming your water grass is going to be set at these different levels, what does this group want the remaining ground covers to be? So that's in the pie charts at the bottom. And then beyond that, what's the willingness to pay for that combination relative to their starting point? And so for this group, it's kind of interesting that actually a lot of these, almost all of these, apart from 100% water grass, are actually higher than their starting point of this baseline park. So they have a preferred combination of 3 ground covers, water grass, not water grass, and native vegetation. And then the other interesting part of these graphs is that this curve is actually quite flat at the top. So even though we saw that their optimal combination was 40% native vegetation, 18% not water grass, and then 35% water grass, well, actually that 35% may be at the very top, I mean, not here because we're setting it at 40, but really if you're between about 20 and 50% water grass in this park, or in a park for this group, that range of 30% water grass and remaining not water grass native vegetation leads to about only a 5% change in the utility associated. So this tells us that park managers don't need to have a park with 35% water grass, but instead they have some flexibility in a range that's still going to leave the public almost at their maximum possible well-off level. For this group, they didn't want to have any mulch. Yeah. So the pie chart on the side, that's the comparison to the baseline level. So the baseline park was 80% water grass and 20% mulch. And it's on here because that's factored into the calculation of compensating surplus, because we're looking at differences in utility from the optimal combination. And in this case, optimal given a constraint and that starting point. So that crosses, that's at the 0 point, because it would just be the same utility subtracted.
These are the optimized outcome given different levels of constraints of water grass, right?
Yeah. The clarification was these are the optimal combinations given constrained levels of water grass.
Except the last 100% cover water grass. On all levels,
yeah,
there are better ways.
Yeah.
Than up to baseline.
Yeah. I mean, this group, they didn't like mulch, right? So they would just, they really didn't like mulch. So they're willing to accept a whole lot less water grass and you just get rid of that mulch.
That 20% is mulch.
Yeah, the yellow is the mulch. Okay. We do the same thing for class 2. They're different, and also the scale is very different across these four groups, which you saw in the willingness to pay at the optimal level. So here, class 2, okay, well, this group actually just wants to have 2 different types of ground covers. It's going to be different combinations of native vegetation and water grass. There are a lot of cases for this group where it would actually be negative to change from that baseline scenario, but again, we have that flatness at the top. So this group, I think their optimal was like 59%, but if you were getting between about 50 and 70%, they're still going to be within their 5% maximum utility, which is good enough. Class 3, okay, it's hard to ignore that it has this funny little kink at the y-axis. So, I mean, I don't want to focus on that too much, but really this kind of anomaly in the willingness to pay curve here is the result of a funny positive square term on the native vegetation coefficient. So you wouldn't really expect that in real life, where someone doesn't like native vegetation until you have a lot of it, and then you really, really like it. So that's not super logical. And again, like nothing was really significant for this class, so we do interpret these results with some caution. So, okay, that's why it doesn't have the nice curve, because of that really annoying positive square term. But beyond that, you tell a similar story. You have that flatness around the top. They may want to have their optimal amount of water grass at 49%, but for these guys, it could be between about 40 and 60, and they're going to be pretty well off. And then the same story for class 4. So they generally prefer to have a combination of water grass and native vegetation and mulch, and then not water grass sneaks in at the beginning there because it also has a positive square term. So I'm not going to get into trees, but I'm just showing this graph without explaining it so that I remember to say, when I read through all the comments of my survey, there was a lot of comments. And in some ways it was really discouraging because there was a lot of like anti-climate change comments, which was surprising because it wasn't really the point of this survey. But the positive comments were that people love trees. People are just obsessed with trees and really concerned about trees for their kids and for themselves, and talked about the ways that trees are really what make the park experience for them. And so this is something that I need to explore a little bit when I discuss these results, even though I kind of glazed over it today because it wasn't my initial focus. We just kind of added it in because trees are part of parks, but yeah, people like trees, and maybe it's actually the most important part of park design. So I have a few conclusions that I think I've already told you because they were asking questions earlier throughout the presentation, but as a reminder, we did a choice experiment. We surveyed the public about their preferences for different types of park designs with a focus on vegetation. And through our latent class analysis, we identified 4 different groups with different preferences. And across all 4 groups, the optimal extent of water grass in parks ranged between 34 and 59%, and that was less than the current baseline, which I kind of believe, and which is going to be different for different LGAs and different neighborhoods, but yeah, it's less than the current practices of about 80%. And if we look at that aggregate optimization by normalizing and looking at shares of the 4 groups, then it's 50% water grass, and then 25% native vegetation and not water grass. And so Warren, my first recommendation is that we tell park managers there's no need to have a park design with more than 50% water grass, because beyond that, it's actually suboptimal for the public. My second conclusion is just this kind of nice consistency within the survey that people who indicated concern over future water scarcity and issues related to future water scarcity, they preferred to have less water grass, around a third of their park be occupied by water grass. So by the flatness of those curves, we can tell park managers that they have some flexibility. I may tell them, this is your optimal for this demographic, but really they have options. So hopefully that helps, especially with the cost side of things. We'll have to factor that in a bit. And then the next stage will be the benefit cost analysis. And I don't entirely know what this is going to look like, but I know that I'm going to need help from people who are actually creating and maintaining parks right now. And fortunately, I have people who are willing to talk to me and help me with that. So I'll leave you with this slide. I went into this study and I thought, let's see how much, if we can minimize how less well off people would be if we take away some grass. And then we kind of got this really convenient result, which is that the public preferences and the environment seem to be working in the same direction in this case from these results. So councils may actually be able to conserve water and make the public better off by rethinking these conventional park designs and removing some water grass for more native vegetation, mulch, and not water grass. Now I'm writing this paper and I am very curious to hear your thoughts and feedback and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the floor is open. We have someone writing on the chat. Let's see. Ben, so if you go, yeah.
Okay, so Ben's asking, are my results sensitive to the assumption of a quadratic functional form? And did I consider other functional forms? That's a good question, and I haven't tested that. Because I just assume that that assumption is so fitting that, of course, you want to have that, leveling off effect. But I could definitely consider that. Yeah, I'm very willing to try new things and, do as many extra modeling tests at this stage. That's how you do it now than later. So thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's important, especially if you are talking to the park managers.
Yeah.
Okay, Jacob.
So, all right. So having lived in Arizona, this is something that this is a topic that's very familiar with. And raising kids in Arizona, where most of our parks have a very different default settings than this 80-20 split. In a place like Arizona, you've got a lot more non-water grass. You've got less mulch. You don't have as much. There's not the emphasis on native vegetation because the native vegetation is spiky and is going to hurt you if you play on it. If your kids play on it, you can spines at them. But so because of this, I'm a little bit skeptical. So as I was listening to you talk about the different classes, for each of the different classes, I was trying to think of, okay, so from a profile perspective, who can I imagine, fitting into these classes? And so I know for myself that I would fit more, or at least when I had kids, when my kids were younger, that it would fall into that class 2, you know, I can see that that's pretty clear. Class 3, I think as indecisive as they may be, I think that I can imagine a profile for that. But the class 1, I'm actually a little bit skeptical about your, in trying to think of who is fitting for that class 1, I'm a little bit skeptical of the sheer amount of native vegetation that is in there. Because I'm wondering if class 1 is more concerned with sport. You know, even if it's not, you know, an active oval, if they want that park space to, you know, to be able to play sport. And I guess with that, it got me thinking about, did you also consider including something like asphalt or bitumen or structured space for like basketball courts, tennis courts, things like that as part of this as well?
Okay. Yeah, those are really good thoughts and interesting considerations to compare it to Arizona. And I also know that, you know, this is not unique to Perth. There's a lot of different places.
This is very we're very comparable to places that also in Southern California, where there has been and that was, I was also wondering what the literature is if you had looked into the xeriscaping literature for looking at specifically Southern California, Arizona, Southwest America.
So I'll start with that second part of the question. So the literature is very focused on private yards and private landscapes and ways that can incentivize homeowners to change their yards. But I didn't actually find as much in the public park setting, and maybe that's because it's not popular to remove grass or whatever. So I mean, maybe I need to do a little bit more research, but it's very, very private yard dominated. And then with your other question about, like, do we believe this class 1? Okay, who are these young men who are concerned about future water scarcity? Well, that's kind of surprising to start with, because normally when you think about concern over the environment, it's usually like women who have that concern, just on average. So that was a bit surprising to me too. And I think it's important to highlight that this is a very specific type of park that I'm thinking about. So these local neighborhood parks, like, yeah, they might have some courts, that's possible. I didn't consider that because it just got a little bit messy. It would have so many different attributes and levels, and I really wanted to understand this more. But then you also mentioned, do these guys just want to play sports, and do they really just care about ovals? Well, now I want to redo the survey, and I want to do another round and consider trade-offs and substitutions that they might be making, and maybe bring in the district and the regional parks, the bigger parks that have those sporting ovals, because.
And I've seen some literature with like proximity to things like larger parks, or proximity to ovals as part of it. So I think that there is literature out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of different directions. Like 1 to 2 more years of my PhD, and so I just need to be selective of where I keep digging in, but it's interesting to think about trade-offs.
Yeah, I think someone has a question. You know, he has left. So if there is anyone, oh, he's back. Okay.
So,
I was going to say let's ask other questions first.
Unwatered grass is green for a significant part of the year. Do you think respondents' views about unwatered grass would have this in mind? That's a good question. I guess I didn't make that super explicit. I mean, I did say that it was in the summertime. You would be seeing these images, but yeah, that could influence things if they are maybe people who actually don't even visit parks in the summertime because it's too hot. And so the fact that they're brown at the hottest and driest months of the year, well, that doesn't really matter to them because they like to go in the winter time anyways. So I didn't consider that. And I wish I had maybe dug into that idea a little bit more. I'll have to think about it, but it is possible that that has influenced how people responded, and that's probably something that I need to discuss and dig into a bit more.
That would be hard to represent.
You sort of hope that they have dug into that. You hope they have thought that, because that's I hope they didn't think that that was what it looked like all year round. The one I'm pointing at, the image on the right, because that isn't what it looks like all year round. So you're sort of hoping they did think that's the summer, winter it's green.
But I don't know.
But you don't know. But yes, so that would be. But what the concern is, they thought it was look round the whole one.
We had some introductions to the choice experiment to the exercise, which was like, it's in the summertime, but it's still possible that, you know, they just saw these images, and so we also unpacked what people relied on to make their decisions, to see how much of a role the images played, and that was kind of interesting. It was almost a perfectly distributed split. It was almost like too perfect to be true. So 50% of the population or so said that they really equally relied on the images and the information in the table. And then a quarter was only the table, and then a quarter was only the images. So I think that's not exactly answering your question, but that's just a fun fact that I forgot to add.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Okay, another survey. Can I ask? Okay, I will ask a question while people are coming up with questions. You didn't say much about suburbs, because in different places things could be quite different in Perth.
Yeah.
Because they, in terms of socio-economic factors and so on.
Yeah.
Also in your model, the demographic variables are quite few. Is that because you tried and threw them out, or is that because you didn't try?
I tested, so in my class membership model, I did test a range of different demographic variables. I didn't include income because so many people just didn't respond to that question, and so it was a little bit less useful. But you're right that parks are going to like different
location, like that, location factors, like.
Yeah. I mean, everyone had to be in the Perth Metropolitan region, but of course, suburbs can be very different. So I could look into that and see if certain postal codes, if I could group them in across different LGAs. That would be interesting. It's also kind of interesting. The follow-up question was if people thought this park looked better than their existing park or not, and that was split.
Also, the livability of something could be different between different places. So if you go to Dalkeith or Netherlands or something, and you try to get them to imagine something that's very different from what they have, it's towards the suburbs.
Yeah.
Probably not. But if you are on somewhere else where it's usually not, you know, it's mulch and so on mainly, the starting point could be quite different.
Yeah.
Alea first, because you have asked twice.
Yes, I did, and that didn't really have any interesting effects when I added it into the model. So almost. I think I tested it, and I thought this is an interesting enough to present, but I should look at that again. Most people are park users at least once a week, and they're for different reasons. Like the reasons are really varied, and actually that is a little bit linked to preferences. Like some people like to go bird watching, well, then they're more likely to prefer the native vegetation ones. And I was curious to see if people who like to use parks for dog walking preferred like perfect green grasses, because that's just a story that I would love to tell. Like dog owners insist on perfect parks.
I was going to just ask that. Why did you not check if they are, you know, a dummy for dogs or?
Yeah, I did try that, but
it didn't work. Yeah. Okay.
The dog doesn't matter.
Michael.
Just a very quick one. You mentioned council rates. You had, I think, 200.
Yeah.
Was that a fixed thing, or did that vary with the different locations? Because council rates could be a kind of proxy for average income of the location.
It was fixed.
Well, I would perhaps make it actually equal to the council rate that actually is in a particular location.
Yeah.
It's an increase, not a certain level.
It's a change.
So the best I could do was test it in my
Okay.
interviews.
Was the 200 an increase?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't understand.
Over the course of the full year. The 200
Okay.
increase.
But it's actually easy to get the council rate. It's public knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So it might actually increase first the realism, and then you might use that a bit as a proxy for the sort of average income of the area.
Yeah.
So the 200 baseline is what's normally expected without anything happening?
Yeah. And so we tested that with our 12 interviews, and people thought, yeah, okay, that's about what I would expect for a typical interview. So that's not perfect. For some people, it's going to be different. I mean, depending what your rent is, but it is over a year, so that was reasonable.
If those of you online, you want to ask, just shout and we can hear you. Actually, I would just, Michael.
First of all, we need to acknowledge how beautiful the images are. Best I've seen it. But I think what we need to do is see whether, this is a thought which I don't like to do, whether people are responding to take the numbers or whether they're responding in a different way to the images. So obviously they are responding to the numbers, they're significant. But are they actively, when they see a change in the green going from 20 to 40 to 60 in the rendering, is that actually what they're seeing? So are they actually able to pick up that in the image?
Yeah.
And there must be a way of doing, exploring that to see whether.
Based on what people relied on in their decision making.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. Another page.
Yeah.
Well,
I didn't have that much budget. I saw that paper. Okay, good idea.
More questions? One last question.
I have a question about the tax. Do you think, because I just find it quite confusing to say you're going to pay, well, yes, it's a tax increase, but I wonder what people thought that they were going to get for that 200 as your base, and whether that might have confused people a little bit.
Yeah, I tried to explain in the lead up that this 200 is not about parks. This is your typical council, like things are just getting more expensive. Your council is going to demand $200 from you regardless. Now changes from that $200 level, those are going to be directly related to the changes that I'm presenting to you.
Yeah.
So it's always hard to know.
Yeah.
Believe it and understand it.
Yeah, because jump.
Yeah.
Jump.
In the mind, it's like,
Yeah, because the zero didn't work for me.
yeah.
Okay, Chambo.
Numbers. You have comparison using the same set of numbers for the question. Replace these pages. Use this resolution. I'll just say you see whether people are really the quality
Yeah.
No, you just use my head. iPhone 4, iPhone 13. At least if you see any difference there, you know that it's
Yeah. But I mean, I don't know. I guess we could have done like a bigger sample and like varied and had some people with images and without images. But I feel like it's kind of already being decided that images help people make maybe more accurate decisions. But then, yeah, the images could be biasing people in certain ways too.
Is there a reason you chose to have the play structure in the image?
Yeah, because I think people it's very typical in the design guidelines for local neighborhood parks. I mean, they're not really strict guidelines, but they almost always include a playground. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so the other amenities are totally constant.
Sure.
Good. I
Thanks
think
for the
that's
feedback.
online. Right. So unless anyone online has a question, we will wrap it up. Okay.